So thank you so much, members of the press, for turning up for this press conference by the civil societies in Africa under the auspices of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Of course, we are representing civil societies in 51 countries in Africa, and again, we're also representing our partners with whom we work with in the continent and beyond. My name is Charles Mwangi. I'm the Acting Executive Director for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and I want to invite my colleagues to also introduce themselves from my extreme right.
Greetings everyone, my name is Philip Kilonzo. I work with Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance as a policy, advocacy and communications lead. Thank you.
Greetings everyone, my name is Catherine Wangeshi. I also work with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. I am an international lawyer.
And I am Eugene Fongwa. I am thematic lead for Just Transition and Energy Access at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance.
So thank you very much. The members of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance would first and foremost wish to express our gratitude to the organizers of this 9th edition of the Africities conference, particularly because we were in the front line of pushing, for African Day to be incorporated within this conference. That was granted, and it was very well executed. So we are very grateful to the organizers, and especially our partners, UCLG, for actually actualizing, that call, because you cannot talk about resilience of the cities without, talking or mentioning about climate crisis that is affecting this continent much more than any other continent in the world. We are going to read our statement, which is our African CSO statement on climate resilience for our cities in Africa. Now, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, and its members, comprising of civil society actors, academia, representatives of women and youth movements, met in Kisumu from 17th of May, and we are here until tomorrow, which is 21st of May, for the 9th edition of the Africities Summit. The summit aimed to consolidate African voices on the role of intermediary cities in Africa in the implementation of the United Nations Agenda 2030 and African Union Agenda 2063. Specifically, the consultative convening focused on the following: unpacking and positioning African cities for the climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience for accelerated realization of United Nations Agenda 2030 and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Detailing the role of cities, local governments, and urban areas in developing urban climate action plans and climate change strategies in alignment with the Glasgow Climate Pact on climate finance, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. 3, delivering a common understanding, voice on roadmap for African cities, governance in alignment with the Paris Agreement of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process, with national governments and non-state actors, including civil societies, as defined by the Marrakech Partnership Global Climate Action, in preparation for United Nations Climate Change Conference COP27 that will be happening in Egypt at Sharm el-Sheikh later in the year. During the 5 days, participants recalled the worsening impact of climate change in African cities and intermediary urban areas, the regrettable lack of commitment in enhancing adaptation and mitigation financing by the highest emitter countries, and the slow progress of climate negotiations related to cities, especially on city-level adaptation and loss and damage agenda items. After considering the different views of all stakeholders, we issue the following statement. acknowledging the critical role of cities, intermediate urban centers, and local governments across Africa that play in implementing the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the African Union Agenda 2063, nationally determined contributions, and new urban agenda, recognizing the rapid urbanization of the continent, the challenges and opportunities this urbanization creates, and the role and position that cities, intermediate urban areas, and local governments play in climate change adaptation, resilience building, and mitigation, embracing the climate action pathway for human settlement of the Marrakech Partnership Global Climate Action, MPGCA, and low carbon, climate resilient development pathways of the Paris Agreement, concerned by the continued pursuit of city-level climate resilience and infrastructure development in Africa through loans in disregard of Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, and certain of the effects of the Glasgow Climate Pact, which does not detail the mechanisms for deploying climate finance and the time needed to translate the pact into action on the state of climate finance, adaptation, and loss and damage and mitigation, extreme events devastate livelihoods, economies across cities, intermediate urban areas, and local governments across Africa, laying our hope on the upcoming UNFCCC subsidiary body intersessions SB 56, which will happen later in the month of June in Bonn, Germany, the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, AMCEN, and the United Nations Climate Change Conference that will be happening in Egypt later in the year, COP27, which are avenues for critical decisions on city-level climate finance and addressing mitigation, adaptation, resilience building, and loss and damage. We, therefore, call on the following. All parties must work towards implementing the new urban agenda and the nationally determined contributions at the levels of the local communities, intermediate urban centers, cities, local governments, and their territories. In this light, therefore, we call on all countries to include and to prioritize on built environment in their adaptation, resilience building, and decarbonization targets, policies, measures, and related mechanisms for implementing the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. B, national and decentralized government should develop climate responsive, climate resilience, people-centered infrastructure in cities, and these will enhance the adaptive capacity of cities, protect vulnerable communities, and restore new and existing infrastructure. To this end, therefore, all new and existing infrastructure financed by the African Union through the AU, PIDA, Africa Development Bank, other DFIs, and the private sector must align with climate resilience designs and maintenance frameworks through the Urban Climate Action Plan and Built Environment Resilience Plan. C, call on cities and local governments and decentralized authorities to initiate a candid conversation on loss and damage. We call on UCLG Africa to urgently convene an African multi-stakeholder dialogue on loss and damage in the perspective of cities and their territories. Cities and local governments in Africa focus on COP27 must emphasize on pressurizing the rich countries to compensate for loss and damage through transparent and accountable financial mechanisms that cities and local governments can access. It's worth noting that about only 20 countries in the world account for more than 80% of total greenhouse gases emissions. It's also worth noting that the same 20 countries control more than 80% of the global GDP, and therefore they are the emitters, but they are also the teams that have the resources to be able to support resilience building in Africa. D, local governments in Africa must call on northern parties of the UNFCCC to deliver needs based on Paris Agreement aligned climate finance for resilience building and transition to low carbon development pathways in African cities. Local governments in Africa must press for resolutions at COP27 to address issues on scaling up predictable, accessible climate finance, actualization of capacity building and skills transfer for city-level resilience on low emissions in line with Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. E, legislative bodies in African countries must pass urban laws that are pro-poor, people-centered, ecologically just, and climate responsive in view to domesticate the new urban agenda. Local governments should enact laws that are cognizant of the unique burdens of the urban poor in the context of current and emerging climate risks and hazards. Laws that will support local governments to promote institutional and financial mechanisms in intermediary cities to effectively implement urban policies, plans, and programs as appropriate. F, city authorities must aim to build just, livable, sustainable, and smart policies for everyone, everywhere in the continent of Africa. We call upon local governments in Africa to join the civil society efforts in pushing developed country partners to support accelerated implementation of NDCs in African countries as they support actions that have direct implications to resilience in the cities. And it is important to underline that most of the nationally determined contribution documents submitted by African countries are highly conditional, indicating the fact that their implementation is subject to availability of resources and more so external funds, which are not forthcoming, and therefore this is hampering the implementation of NDCs in the African continent. We call for just, livable, sustainable, and smart status created through global, regional, national, and local partnerships and collaboration between cities, public and non-state actors as espoused in the Marrakech Partnership Global Climate Action MPGCA, Sustainable and Smart Cities for All in Africa. This would involve incorporating equity and fairness, climate justice, health and well-being, inclusivity, and sector resilience in the sector priorities of buildings, energy, water, waste, and transport sectors. Now, on buildings, we call for acceleration in the reduction of energy and water consumption in the new and existing homes, businesses, and public buildings. Incentives for green building, including the development of city-level green building policies and bylaws, and the development of urban climate action plans in consultation with the local green building councils, city-level building resilience to adverse weather impacts such as heat and flooding. On the energy sector, we call for cities or city authorities to provide leadership in driving decentralized renewable energy uptake and just transition in Africa, because cities account for 60% emissions from energy sources and hold majority of jobs to be affected in transition to low carbon development. In light of this, cities and urban areas must develop their sustainable energy and transition plans. On the water sector, we call for acceleration of demand management through water efficiency, water reuse and recycling, energy efficient water treatment, infrastructure resilience, and emergency plans for supply disruptions. On waste, we call on promotion of circular economy in managing waste in cities through circularity and through reducing, reusing, and recycling waste. Development of city waste to energy and increased resilience of landfills to natural disasters. On transport sector, we call for acceleration in options for mass transit and non-motorized transportation, cleaner fuels, and electric vehicle transport infrastructure, climate-proofing transit infrastructure, congestion pricing, and other forms of demand management for private vehicles that lead to transport emissions and air pollution. Finally, on climate data, cities and urban areas must strengthen capacity and invest in systems of information management, including digitization to guide in climate change adaptation, resilience, and mitigation planning and development. So we want to thank everyone, and particularly our partners, UCLG, because of working together with us. And the members of Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance are glad that we were able to sign a memorandum of understanding with UCLG. And of course, we have agreed on a roadmap that we are going to use in terms of pushing for city resilience going forward. Thank you very much. And we invite questions from the members of the fourth estate.
Duncan Boya from Chinese News Agency. I just want to get more from you on issues adaptation. I want to know more how communities living in cities are adapting to climate change.
Thank you so much, and I want to usher in my colleague, Eugene, to probably tackle that question.
I think the first thing to point out is that the cities are so crucial in addressing climate change in the sense that it's in the cities where the vast majority of Africans live. Increasingly, we're seeing a migration of populations towards city centers, and Africa is on track to have some of the largest urban centers in the world, with cities like Nigeria, Cairo, and so forth. And so most of the people who are going to be affected by climate change will be based in the city at some point in the future. And that's why adaptation at the city level is very crucial in how we address the climate crisis. And this would require quite some substantial investment in building urban infrastructure that can enable people to minimize the harm that extreme weather such as floods and in some places, as we've seen in Southern Africa, cyclones can affect populations, either directly through impacts on their livelihoods, but also impacts on their properties, buildings, and urban infrastructure like roads and bridges, and water supply and energy supply. And so adaptation at the city level is really, really at the heart of actions that cities need to take to not only address the climate crisis, but also protect their populations from the adverse effects of climate change. But also, it's really hard to talk about the impact of climate change in urban areas without talking about the potential for loss and damage. The need, as we have said in our statement, to be a more candid conversation, and in fact, I must say an urgent conversation about the questions around the losses and damage that come as a result of climate change impacts. And most of these loss and damages you will find will be in the urban centers where we have a concentration of populations, but also a concentration of investment, whether in terms of the built environment or the supply of social services. And we can have a very extended conversation about adaptation at the city level, but I think this sort of summarizes the issues around adaptation at the city level. Charles.
Thank you so much. Any other question from the media? Thank you so much. My colleague Philip will address this in the context of locally led climate action.
Great. I think what is important, and your question is quite spot on, is to appreciate the fact that cities ordinarily should be designed to be sustainable and to be self-reliant in quite a number of aspects. And indeed, part of the reason as why urban agriculture has not been happening has been a gap in terms of planning. It should be like a complete ecosystem. So indeed, yes, urban agriculture is quite welcome. Within context, it must be done in a safe way. And if you look at countries like Kenya, you'll find that they have policies around urban and peri-urban agriculture, which are quite progressive. And indeed, in terms of building resilience, is basically looking at how do we take these policies forward, and how do we make sure that urban agriculture is safe and is actually reinforcing the plans around building resilience and addressing gaps that are there within the urban spaces, which has been a thing that is important to note. But it's also important also to appreciate your question within the context of how the cities are expanding, because a majority of cities are actually expanding into what previously used to be agricultural lands. And that is happening because there is generally lack of planning in terms of how the cities are meant to expand, where are they meant to expand, and what kind of implications do those plans pose in terms of food security. And therefore, in terms of really doing the whole resilience process, in the resilience consideration in the process of planning, is then to bring these dimensions that have been missing in the process. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other question?
Maybe my last question. So much about NDCs. We know that Kenya presented one which is believed to be the most vibrant, and so is other African countries. But looking at COVID-19 and the effects it left in the West, you know, what are your suggestions to government? Because I don't see the government meeting these commitments because they expect much from the West. So how do you look at this? How can African governments come out and meet the commitments on their own without relying on external support?
Thank you so much. I'll address that, and my colleague Catherine is going to come in to talk about the impacts really of NDCs, of COVID-19 in our work. But I want to mention something about the nationally determined contributions. Well, this fact must not escape our mind that Africa is only contributing 4% of the total greenhouse gases emissions. And therefore, even though Africa, reduces its emission, to zero, you'd still have another 96% that is coming elsewhere. And therefore, it's important to underline the fact that the adaptation needs for Africa are much more, really, than the mitigation needs. Mitigation presents an opportunity for us to transition and head into low carbon development. But adaptation is a necessity, and we must make sure that we actually adapt. We have no choice, than to build up resilience, of our economies, our livelihoods, and so on and so forth. But you realize that countries, of course, submitted the NDCs, and Africa has some of the most ambitious nationally determined contributions. But the tragedy of the matter is, if you look at the budget proposals for implementation of those NDCs, the implementation is so much pegged to availability of resources from outside. And we are saying this must happen because those who are responsible for these emissions must actually pay, or support countries in Africa, in terms of implementation of the NDCs. So it's not an issue of asking for tokens per se. It's an issue of really calling for the right of the Africans to be able to receive these resources and be able to implement the NDCs as planned. However, it's also important for our African governments to look inwardly and mobilize, domestic resources so that we are also not just victims of climate change, but we also change agents in the same. Now, in terms of how COVID-19 has affected, generally climate change interventions, I call upon Catherine to talk about that.
Thank you, Charles. And yeah, indeed, COVID-19 has been a great burden in all African countries, and of course also in the North and in the West. But just to add on to what Charles is talking about, we're not just advocating for an upward-looking mechanism in addressing some of the challenges we've experienced so far, but also acknowledging the fact that internally we have the capacity to bring ourselves out of the burdens that were imposed on us by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this, we are also saying that if you look at the decentralization, the upcoming continuity of decentralization across Africa since the 1993, you realize that governments are increasingly adopting decentralization as a mechanism to deal with the impacts of climate change and loss and damage. And we are forcefully insisting that indeed we can develop laws and policies that can address this. We're saying that intermediary cities and intermediary local authorities that have the responsibility to deal with some of the challenges experienced in the intermediary cities have the capacity to come up with laws that can remedy this situation. And that is why we're insisting that even as we speak to our legislators, and it is a good thing that this Africities Summit has brought together the mayors and some of the lawmakers, that we have a conversation with them, that even as we develop the laws and policies around these issues, that they are cognizant of some of the challenges that could emerge in the coming future, and that they are in a position to capture the needs of the local communities within the urban cities and the intermediary cities as well. And that these are the laws that can be actioned to benefit the poor. Remember, we're also recognizing that there's a disproportionate burden borne by the urban poor, and that these are laws that must address these challenges. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the media? All right, so thank you so much for listening to us, and we have printouts for this statement that can be distributed to the media by our colleague Henry. Thank you.
Thank you.
How much time did we have?
Oh my God.
No idea.
Probably.